Not all horror stories happen in movies. Sometimes the worst nightmares are on the deserted road you know well, in the forest that always seems peaceful, or on that beach where no one else goes. These are stories submitted by listeners who have experienced the unexplainable, dark encounters, creatures that defy logic, and places where fear lurks in the shadows. Brace yourself, because these are not stories for the faint of heart. Would you have the courage to face what they faced? The encounter on the desert road. I was driving alone on a Friday night, returning from a work trip that took me to rural Nevada. The road, one of those that seems to never end, was completely deserted. No houses, no cars, and what bothered me most was the black sky, with no moon. The only light I had was from my car headlights. As the minutes passed, a feeling of isolation came over me. The music on the radio was completely gone, all that was left was the annoying hiss of static. I tried searching for stations, but none picked up. It was as if he was crossing a void, a part of the world where nothing else existed. It was then that I saw something. Ahead, on the side of the road, was a figure. At first I thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or coyote, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. His back was to me, still, not moving, completely still. A chill went up my spine. The man was wearing what looked like an old suit, something that didn't fit in at all with the barren, deserted scenery around him. The natural instinct would be to stop and offer help. But something was wrong. An inner voice, almost like a warning cry, told me not to stop. I continued driving, slowly, and as I passed the man, I tried to avoid looking directly at him. It was difficult. Curiosity and fear fought inside me, but I knew I had to move forward. However, as I crossed the point where he was, I looked in the rearview mirror and what I saw took my breath away. The man, who had previously been standing still, was now in the middle of the road. He was facing me, his dark and empty eyes seemed to stare at me. My heart raced in my chest, and I instinctively sped up. As the car gained speed, I looked in the mirror once again and he was gone. How was this possible? The road was completely straight, with nowhere for him to hide. For days, I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was an effect of fatigue, or the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But what disturbed me most was the fact that a week later, while talking to a friend who knows the area well, he casually mentioned, "Oh, Route 13. That place is famous for an old legend. They say drivers lonely people see a man on the side of the road, always wearing an old suit." The blood drained from my face at that moment. I saw him. And since then, I've never driven there again. The Forbidden Room. It was during a business trip that I stayed in an old and somewhat eccentric hotel in the heart of a small town. I had spent the day in endless meetings and when I arrived at the hotel, all I wanted was to rest. The place, although charming, was evidently old, with dark wood furniture and rugs that had seen better days. The air had a peculiar smell, a mix of mustiness and something I couldn't identify. Check-in was normal until the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with cold eyes and a stern expression, made a strange comment, "Please avoid room 214. It is not safe." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of local joke or superstition. But when I asked her why, she simply looked away and repeated, "It's for your safety. Trust me." This type of comment only served to increase my curiosity. I went up to my room on the second floor, and as I passed through the quiet hallway, I inevitably passed room 214. The door was closed, but something about the atmosphere around that room made me uncomfortable. The air felt colder, and for a second, I felt like I was being watched. I ignored my instincts and entered my room. The night was peaceful, until, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low, hoarse laugh that seemed to come from the other side of the wall, exactly where room 214 was. I remained silent, trying to hear better, but the sound soon disappeared. The next day, the receptionist's warning became even more disturbing. When I came down for breakfast, she looked at me with a wry smile, as if she knew something I didn't. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. I tried to ignore the discomfort and continued my routine. But on the third night, the situation escalated. Again, I heard laughter coming from room 214, and this time it sounded like someone was banging on the walls. The sound woke me from a deep sleep, and I felt a shiver run up my spine. I went to my bedroom door and opened it slowly. The hallway was empty and silent, but the sound of knocking continued, coming from inside the forbidden room. I took courage and, driven by insane curiosity, knocked on the door of room 214. There was no answer. The knocking stopped immediately. My breathing was heavy and rapid, and, before I could step back, the door slowly opened on its own. Inside, the air was freezing, and the room was empty. However, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, until I saw something reflected in the bathroom mirror, an indistinct figure, standing behind me, with empty eyes and a macabre smile. I ran out of there, without looking back. When checking out the next morning, the receptionist looked at me again with that same strange smile. "Now you know," she said, cryptically. I never knew what really happened in room 214, but ever since that night, disturbing dreams have haunted me, always taking me back to that hotel and that door that should never have been opened. The beach creature. I grew up in a beach town in Maine where everyone knew the strange stories surrounding one of the local beaches called Lighthouse Beach. Ever since I was little, I had heard reports of people seeing strange lights over the ocean and hearing unexplained sounds coming from the abandoned lighthouse. My parents always said to avoid that area, especially at night. They said the place had a dark history. My friends and I, however, were curious teenagers. We decided that one night would be the perfect time to finally explore Praia do Farol and prove that all those stories were just myths. Ethan, Tommy, and I grabbed our bikes and pedaled toward the beach around 10 p.m. The beach, during the day, seemed normal, but at night it had a different energy. The abandoned lighthouse on top of the cliff stood like a shadowy sentinel, watching the dark sea and the waves that crashed fiercely against the rocks. The wind was stronger that night, carrying the salty smell of water and the unsettling sound of the ocean. "Let's go to the lighthouse," said Ethan, always the bravest of the group. "They say you can see everything from up there, even what you don't want to see." We laughed, but something about the way he spoke made my stomach turn. Something told me that maybe we shouldn't be there. We heard the distant sound of seagulls, but it seemed out of place, as if it were echoing from somewhere deeper. I ignored the discomfort, convinced that there was nothing dangerous about those haunting stories. On the way to the lighthouse, we passed a secluded area of the beach. It was then that I saw it for the first time. Something was emerging from the water. "What is that?" I asked, abruptly stopping my bike. Tommy and Ethan also stopped and looked toward the water. At first glance, I thought it was an animal, perhaps a large fish or a seal. But as it came out of the water, I realized it was nothing like that. He was a tall, thin figure, with grayish skin that glowed in the moonlight. Its shape was humanoid, but its arms and legs were too long, almost disproportionate. And the eyes, his eyes shone with an intense light, like headlights. "What is that?" Ethan whispered, his voice breaking the heavy silence around us. The creature came completely out of the water and began to slowly walk towards us, moving in a way that seemed wrong, as if it were getting used to walking on dry land. My body froze. I wanted to run, but something was stopping me, as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, Tommy screamed. That scream was enough to wake us up from that terrifying trance. Without hesitation, we hopped on our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could back to town. Neither of us looked back, but I knew it had been watching us the whole time. When we got home, we tried to understand what we saw. No one wanted to admit that it was something supernatural, but we all knew that what we had seen was not normal. Ethan, usually the most fearless, remained silent for the rest of the night, visibly shaken. I couldn't get the image of those eyes glowing in the dark out of my mind. After that night, none of us returned to Praia do Farol. I still hear the stories of strange lights and sounds coming from the lighthouse, but now, I know there is something much more sinister hidden in the depths of the ocean. Perhaps the creature is still there, waiting for the next group of onlookers. The forest of no return. It was supposed to be a simple trail. My group of friends and I had decided to spend the weekend camping in a remote area of a national forest. Nothing too risky, just a short hike and then we would set up camp near a lake. Everything was going well until we started hearing a strange sound coming from the trees, as if something was moving through the bushes, following us. At first we thought it was just some small animal, maybe a squirrel or rabbit, but the sounds got louder, as if something bigger was watching us. At one point, one of my friends, Chris, decided we would look into it. We walked about 10 meters into the woods, and then we found something that none of us expected, an old wooden cabin, completely out of place. It looked abandoned for decades, but the structure was intact. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to see what was inside. When we opened the door, the smell of mold and rotting wood hit us. But what disturbed us most was what was on the floor, a series of strange marks and symbols carved into the wood. They seemed like part of some kind of ancient ritual, but nothing like we were familiar with. Suddenly, Chris crouched down, pointing to something in the corner of the room. There was a pile of bones, clearly human. Without thinking twice, we ran out of the cabin and back to camp as quickly as we could. None of us slept that night, and at dawn, we left the place, vowing never to return. I still think about that cabin and wonder what or who used it, and if they were still there, watching us. The cabin in the woods. I grew up hearing stories about the Hut of Silence, a remote place in the middle of the forest, where no one dared to go. They said that those who entered never came out. My grandparents, who lived in a small town in rural Colorado, used to tell me that the cabin was cursed. That something lived inside, something that wanted more than just a scare. I never believed these stories. I always thought they were just stories to keep children out of the forest. So, when I turned 18, I decided to prove it was all nonsense. I invited 3 friends, Charlie, Amanda and Jake, to go to the cabin and spend the night there. The idea seemed fun, a chance to laugh at the legends and feel brave. The path through the forest was peaceful. The wind swayed the trees and the sound of dry leaves beneath our feet seemed to increase as we approached the site. After an hour of walking, we finally saw the cabin. It was small, made of old, worn wood, with broken windows and a door that creaked in the wind. Around her, the silence was almost oppressive. As soon as we entered, the air seemed to get heavier. The cabin was empty, but the wooden floor creaked with every step we took. The only furniture was a table and 2 chairs, covered in dust. The walls were marked with strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. They were symbols we had never seen before, and their presence made us uncomfortable. "We're just going to be here for an hour, and then we'll come back," Charlie said, trying to keep his tone light, but there was something in his voice that betrayed his nervousness. We settled on the floor, lit only by our flashlights. Time seemed to drag by, and the feeling of being watched began to grow. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was surrounding us. It was then that we heard the first noise. A soft scratching coming from outside. "It's just an animal," Jake said, but his voice was strained. Then the knocking started. There were firm, rhythmic knocks, as if something was trying to enter. We all froze, and the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The cold took over the room, and the sound of something dragging outside became deafening. Suddenly, the door was opened with brutal force. The darkness outside seemed to swallow us, but what appeared at the cabin's entrance made us scream in pure terror. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something in between. Her eyes glowed a deep red, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. We ran away. Without thinking twice, we ran back through the forest, without looking back. The sound of heavy footsteps followed us for a while, until it finally stopped. When we arrived in the city, sweaty and panting, no one said a word. We never mentioned the cabin again. We never knew what really happened that night. But one thing is certain, the stories were not just legends. Something lives in those woods, and the shack of silence holds secrets that should never be revealed. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.